The morning mist clung to the Mississippi River like a shroud as Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter stood on the hurricane deck of his flagship, the ironclad Benton. The date was February 5th, 1863, and the 50-year-old naval commander gazed upstream toward the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg with the calculating eyes of a man who understood that rivers could be conquered just as surely as cities. In his weathered hands, he held reports from Washington that made his mission crystal clear. Control of the Mississippi River was not merely desirable, it was essential to preserving the Union. Porter's fleet represented the most formidable concentration of naval power ever assembled on America's inland waters. 13 ironclad gunboats rode at anchor in the muddy current, their thick armor plates gleaming dully in the pale sunlight. The Benton, Carondelet, Cincinnati, Louisville, Mound City, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis formed the backbone of his river navy, each vessel bristling with heavy cannons capable of reducing stone fortifications to rubble. Admiral, called Commander Thomas Oliver Selfridge, approaching with the latest intelligence reports. Our scouts confirmed that the Confederates had mounted at least 150 guns along the Vicksburg bluffs. They positioned everything from 24-pounder smoothbores to rifled cannons that can punch through our armor at close range. Porter nodded grimly. He had studied the Confederate defenses with the methodical attention of a chess master analyzing his opponent's position. The rebel engineers had transformed Vicksburg into what they proudly called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, with artillery batteries positioned at multiple elevations. Along the 200-foot bluffs, the water battery, located at river level, could deliver devastating crossfire, while the elevated positions on the heights could rain plunging shot down upon any vessel attempting to pass. The strategic importance of Vicksburg extended far beyond its impressive fortifications. The city commanded the last Confederate-controlled section of the Mississippi River, serving as a vital link between the Eastern Confederacy and the resource-rich states of Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Cotton, cattle, grain, and manufactured goods flowed through this crucial bottleneck, sustaining the Confederate war effort when other supply lines had been severed. According to naval historian James Tertius DK's The Rebel Raiders, the Union's river strategy represented a revolutionary approach to warfare, using naval power to strangle the Confederacy's economic lifelines while supporting land operations. With unprecedented firepower, Porter's own path to command had been marked by innovation and controversy. The son of Commodore David Porter, a hero of the War of 1812, he had entered the Navy as a midshipman at age 16 and spent decades learning the intricacies of naval warfare on both blue water and brown. His experience in the Mexican War had taught him the value of joint operations between Army and Navy, lessons that would prove invaluable in the complex campaign ahead. The Confederate naval response was limited but determined. Captain Isaac Newton Brown commanded a small flotilla of river defense boats, including the ironclad Arkansas and several converted steamboats armed with whatever guns could be procured. These vessels lacked the armor and firepower of Porter's fleet, but they enjoyed the advantage of fighting in familiar waters with the support of shore batteries. As Porter studied the tactical situation, he recognized that traditional naval engagements would not suffice. The narrow confines of the river, the presence of extensive fortifications, and the need to coordinate with Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant's army required a new approach to warfare. Naval bombardment would need to be precisely coordinated with land operations, while river control would become as much about logistics and transportation as about combat. The ironclad gunboats themselves represented the cutting edge of mid-19th century military technology. Their thick armor plates, varying from 2.5 to 4.5 inches in thickness, could withstand all but the heaviest Confederate artillery. Their powerful engines, fed by coal brought up from supply bases hundreds of miles downstream, gave them the mobility to strike at multiple points along the river. Standing on his flagship's deck, watching the muddy waters of the Mississippi flow past, Porter understood that the coming campaign would test every aspect of naval warfare. The fate of the Union might well depend on his ability to master this inland sea. The pre-dawn darkness of March 25, 1863, was shattered by the thunderous roar of naval gunfire as Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter launched the first systematic bombardment of Vicksburg's river defenses. From his position aboard the ironclad Benton, Porter watched as his fleet of 13 warships opened fire with a precision and fury that had never before been witnessed on American waters. The bombardment began with the deep, resonant boom of the Benton's 11-inch Dahlgren guns. Their massive shells are seen high over the Mississippi River before crashing into the Confederate earthworks with devastating effect. Within minutes, the entire Union fleet had joined the cannonade, creating a symphony of destruction that could be heard for miles along the river valley. Commander Henry Walk, commanding the ironclad Carondelet, positioned his vessel to deliver enfilading fire against the Confederate water battery. His 8-inch and 9-inch guns hammered the rebel positions with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed to maximize damage to the enemy's artillery emplacements. The Carondelet had earned fame as one of the first ironclads to prove effective in river warfare, and Walk was determined to add Vicksburg to his vessel's list of victories. The Confederate response was immediate and fierce. Colonel Edward Higgins, commanding the river defenses, had positioned his artillery to create overlapping fields of fire that would devastate any fleet attempting to approach the city. The 32-pounder smoothbores of the water battery opened fire first, their solid shots striking the Union ironclads with ringing impacts that echoed across the water like giant hammer blows. "Range, 800 yards and closing," shouted Lieutenant Commander Thomas Owen Selfridge from the pilot house of the gunboat Cairo. All guns commenced firing for effect. The Cairo's 13-inch mortar, mounted on her forward deck, began lobbing explosive shells into the Confederate positions with devastating accuracy. These massive projectiles, weighing over 100 pounds each, could demolish entire sections of earthwork with a single hit. The psychological effect on the defenders was as important as the physical damage. The screaming descent of mortar shells created terror, even among veteran soldiers. Naval historian John Milligan noted in Gunboats Down the Mississippi that this bombardment represented the first sustained use of naval artillery against land fortifications in American military history, establishing tactical principles that would influence warfare for decades to come. The ironclad Louisville, under Commander Elias Kane Owen, maneuvered closer to the Confederate positions than any vessel had previously dared, her captain, displaying the aggressive spirit that characterized Porter's fleet commanders, brought his ship to within 500 yards of the enemy guns. At this range, the Louisville's heavy artillery could penetrate even the thickest Confederate earthworks, but the vessel also became vulnerable to plunging fire from the elevated batteries. Confederate Captain Isaac Newton Brown, observing the battle from his headquarters overlooking the river, realized that his limited naval forces could not hope to match the Union fleet in a direct engagement. Instead, he ordered his gunboats to take position behind the protection of the shore batteries, where they could add their firepower to the defensive effort while remaining relatively safe. From Porter's heavy guns, the bombardment continued for 6 hours, with over 3,000 shells fired by the Union fleet. The Confederate fortifications, despite their impressive appearance, began to show signs of serious damage. Embrasures were widened by repeated hits. Gun crews were driven from their positions by accurate fire, and several artillery pieces were dismounted or destroyed outright. Civilian residents of Vicksburg, huddled in their basements and hastily dug shelters, experienced the full terror of modern naval warfare. Marion Loubrow, a resident whose husband served in the Confederate Army, wrote in her diary, "The bombardment from the river is continuous and terrifying. The house shakes with each explosion, and we can hear the shells whizzing overhead. The children cry constantly, and we adults can only pray for deliverance." The tactical lessons learned during this bombardment would prove crucial to the larger campaign. Porter discovered that his ironclads could deliver sustained, accurate fire against land targets while remaining relatively invulnerable to Confederate counter-battery fire. However, he also learned that naval bombardment alone could not reduce fortified positions. Close coordination with land forces would be essential for ultimate success. As the guns fell silent in the afternoon, Porter surveyed the results of his fleet's work with satisfaction. The Confederate defenses had been damaged, but not destroyed, and he knew that much harder fighting lay ahead. The night of April 16, 1863, was moonless and still as Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter prepared to execute one of the most daring naval operations of the Civil War. His mission was deceptively simple yet extraordinarily dangerous. Run his fleet past the Vicksburg batteries under cover of darkness, carrying the supplies and naval support that Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant desperately needed. For his bold campaign south of the city, Porter stood on the hurricane deck of his flagship Benton, studying the Confederate positions through his night glass. The enemy batteries stretched along the bluffs for nearly 3 miles, their dark gun embrasures barely visible against the star-filled sky. Intelligence reports indicated that the Confederates had positioned over 150 cannons along this deadly gauntlet, including some of the heaviest artillery pieces west of the Mississippi River, signaled the fleet. Porter commanded his flag captain, Commander George Melville Brown. All vessels will proceed in single file, maintaining intervals of 100 yards. Dead slow until we're discovered, then full speed ahead. Every gun that bears will return fire. But our primary objective is to get past those batteries intact. The fleet that prepared to challenge the Confederate defenses represented the pinnacle of Union naval engineering. 7 ironclad gunboats formed the core of the flotilla: Benton, Lafayette, Louisville, Mound City, Pittsburgh, Carondelet, and Tuscumbia. Behind them came 3 transports loaded with critical supplies: Henry Clay, Forest Queen, and Silver Wave, their holds packed with ammunition, medical supplies, and rations. At exactly 11:15 that night, the Benton nosed into the current and began the perilous journey downstream. Her pilot, Mississippi River veteran Samuel Clemens, who would later achieve fame as Mark Twain, guided the massive ironclad through the treacherous waters. With skill born of decades on the river, the current ran swift and strong, helping to carry the vessels past the enemy guns, but also making precise navigation more difficult. In the darkness, military historian Shelby Foote observed in the Civil War a narrative that Porter's decision to run the Vicksburg batteries represented one of the most audacious naval operations in American history, combining technical innovation with raw courage in equal measure. The Confederate lookouts spotted the Union fleet at approximately 11:30, and within minutes the night exploded into chaos. The first cannon shot came from the water battery, its muzzle flash lighting up the river like lightning. The shell screamed across the water, passing just over the Benton's pilot house before exploding harmlessly in the Louisiana swamps. All guns commenced firing. Porter shouted over the growing din of battle. The Benton's 11-inch Dahlgren guns thundered. In response, their massive shells crashing into the Confederate positions with devastating effect. Sparks flew as the ironclad's heavy shots struck the limestone bluffs, and the air filled with the acrid smoke of burned gunpowder. The ironclad Lafayette, following close behind, took a direct hit from a Confederate 32-pounder that struck her casemate with a ringing crash. The solid shot, fired at point-blank range, failed to penetrate the vessel's 4-inch armor, but left a deep dent that would serve as a permanent reminder of the night's action. Commander Henry Knox Thatcher, the Lafayette's commanding officer, calmly ordered his gun crews to continue firing as debris rained down around them. The transport Henry Clay, loaded with medical supplies and carrying several Army surgeons, became the focus of concentrated Confederate fire. Captain William Hughes fought desperately to save his vessel as shells crashed into her wooden hull. But the damage was too severe. Within minutes, the transport was ablaze from stem to stern, her crew leaping into the dark waters of the Mississippi. As she drifted downstream like a floating funeral pyre, the battle raged for 2.5 hours as the Union fleet fought its way past the Vicksburg defenses. The ironclad Tuscumbia, bringing up the rear of the formation, suffered mechanical failure when a Confederate shell damaged her steering gear. Lieutenant Commander James Walter Shirk found his vessel helpless in the current, broadside to the enemy guns, as his crew worked frantically to repair the damage. Confederate artillery crews, many of them experienced gunners from the pre-war regular Army, maintained a withering fire throughout the engagement. Colonel Edward Higgins had trained his men well, and their accuracy in the darkness was remarkable. Shell after shell found its mark, though most failed to penetrate the thick armor of the Union ironclads. The morning of April 29, 1863, witnessed the beginning of the most sophisticated joint operation between Union, naval, and land forces attempted during the Civil War, as Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant's army prepared to cross the Mississippi River at Bruinsburg. Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter positioned his fleet to provide devastating covering fire that would suppress Confederate resistance and ensure the success of the amphibious assault. Porter's tactical deployment demonstrated the evolution of naval warfare, from simple ship-to-ship combat to complex combined operations. The ironclad Benton, with her powerful 11-inch guns, anchored in the main channel where she could deliver accurate fire against any Confederate battery that threatened the crossing. The Louisville and Carondelet took positions closer to shore, their 8-inch and 9-inch cannons ready to engage enemy infantry positions and field artillery. Commander Henry Walk, veteran of numerous river engagements, directed the fire of his ironclad Carondelet with the precision of a master artillerist. His gun crews had trained for months in the techniques of shore bombardment, learning to adjust their fire based on spotting reports from Army observers. Positioned on the Louisiana shore, each shot was carefully aimed to maximize damage while minimizing the risk to advancing Union infantry. Range 1,200 yards to the Confederate earthworks, called Lieutenant George Washington Baird from the Carondelet's pilot house. All guns, load with high explosive and prepare for sustained bombardment. The Confederate response was immediate but limited. Brigadier General John Stevens Bowen, commanding the Confederate forces at Grand Gulf, had positioned his artillery to command the river approaches, but his guns were outnumbered and outranged by Porter's ironclads. The Confederate batteries included several rifle pieces capable of penetrating ironclad armor, but their elevated position made it difficult to achieve direct hits on the Union vessels. The crossing itself became a masterpiece of military coordination. Grant's soldiers, loaded into transports and smaller craft, moved across the mile-wide river under the protective umbrella of naval gunfire. The ironclads maintained a constant bombardment of the Confederate positions, their shells exploding with devastating effect among the enemy earthworks. According to James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, this amphibious operation demonstrated that Union forces had learned to integrate naval and land operations with a sophistication that rivaled the best European military establishments. The transport Forest Queen, under Captain James Mason, carried the first wave of assault troops from McClernand's 13th Corps. As Confederate artillery opened fire on the vulnerable transport, Porter's gunboats immediately shifted their fire to suppress the enemy batteries. The ironclad Pittsburgh, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Leroy Fitch, closed to within 800 yards of the Confederate guns and poured devastating fire into their positions. The psychological effect of naval bombardment on Confederate defenders was as important as the physical damage inflicted. Soldiers who had never experienced the massive explosions of 11-inch naval shells found their morale shattered by the continuous bombardment. Many Confederate units, despite their officers' efforts to maintain discipline, began withdrawing from positions that had become untenable under the weight of naval firepower. Captain Isaac Newton Brown, observing the action from his vantage point on the Confederate ironclad Arkansas, realized that his small river defense fleet could not hope to match Porter's firepower. Instead, he positioned his vessels where they could support the shore batteries while remaining under their protective umbrella. This defensive strategy, while prudent, effectively ceded control of the river to the Union Navy. The Union landing proceeded with remarkable efficiency. By noon, Grant had established a solid beachhead on the Mississippi shore, with over 15,000 troops safely across the river. The naval bombardment had suppressed Confederate resistance so effectively that casualties during the crossing were minimal, a testament to the devastating effectiveness of coordinated fire and movement. Porter's fleet continued to provide fire support as Grant's army advanced inland. The ironclads moved upstream and downstream along the river, their guns ready to engage any Confederate force that threatened the Union bridgehead. This mobile artillery support gave Grant's forces a significant advantage in their subsequent battles at Port Gibson and Raymond. The success at Bruinsburg established the pattern for Union operations. Throughout the Vicksburg campaign, naval power would provide the mobility and firepower necessary to support Grant's audacious strategy, while Army forces would secure the territory needed to establish permanent control over the Mississippi River. The morning of May 18, 1863, found Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter implementing the most comprehensive naval blockade ever attempted on America's inland waters. As Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant's army settled into siege positions around Vicksburg, Porter's fleet established an iron ring of control that would slowly strangle the Confederate stronghold into submission. The blockade extended far beyond simple military considerations. Porter understood that Vicksburg's civilian population depended entirely on river commerce for survival, and that cutting off this lifeline would be as effective as any bombardment enforcing the city's surrender. His ironclads and gunboats took positions at strategic points along the Mississippi, creating an impenetrable barrier that no Confederate vessel could hope to breach. Commander Thomas Oliver Selfridge, aboard the ironclad Cairo, established the northern anchor of the blockade above Vicksburg. His vessel's 13-inch mortar and heavy guns commanded the river approaches, while her thick armor provided protection against Confederate artillery fire from the bluffs. The Cairo had earned fame as one of the most effective river gunboats in the Union fleet, and Selfridge was determined to maintain that reputation during the siege. Signal all vessels. Porter commanded from his flagship Benton. Maintain constant patrols. Nothing moves on this river without our permission. Any Confederate vessel attempting to run the blockade is to be captured or destroyed. The Confederate response to the Union blockade revealed the desperate situation. Facing the defenders of Vicksburg, Captain Isaac Newton Brown, commanding the remaining Confederate naval forces, possessed only a handful of vessels capable of challenging Porter's fleet: the ironclad Arkansas, several converted steamboats, and a few small gunboats comprised the entire Confederate river navy in the Vicksburg vicinity. The Union blockade's effectiveness was immediately apparent. Before the siege, Vicksburg had received regular shipments of food, ammunition, and medical supplies via the Mississippi River. Confederate steamboats had operated with relative impunity, carrying cotton downstream to market and returning with manufactured goods from New Orleans and other southern ports. Now, this vital commerce ground to a complete halt. Naval historian John Milligan observed in Gunboats Down the Mississippi that Porter's blockade represented the first systematic application of naval power to completely isolate a land-based objective, demonstrating principles that would influence naval strategy well into the 20th century. The ironclad Louisville, under Commander Elias Owen, patrolled the river south of Vicksburg with methodical precision. Her crew had perfected the techniques of interdicting Confederate river traffic, using their vessel's superior speed and firepower to capture or destroy any enemy craft attempting to reach the besieged city. The Louisville's 8-inch guns could sink any civilian vessel at long range, while her armor made her invulnerable to small arms fire from Confederate sharpshooters. Along the riverbank, the human cost of the blockade became apparent within weeks of its implementation. Vicksburg's civilian population, already suffering from the constant bombardment, now faced the specter of starvation as food supplies dwindled. Marion Loughborough, writing in her diary, described the growing desperation. The river, once our highway to the world, has become our prison wall. No supplies can reach us, and we watch our children grow thinner each day. Confederate attempts to break the blockade proved futile. Against Porter's overwhelming naval superiority, on June 3rd, Captain Brown attempted to run supplies into Vicksburg, using a small flotilla of fast steamboats under cover of darkness. The attempt was detected by Union picket boats, and the Confederate vessels came under devastating fire from multiple ironclads. The steamboats were sunk, and the remainder fled upstream, their mission a complete failure. The blockade's psychological impact extended beyond Vicksburg itself. Confederate forces throughout the Mississippi Valley realized that Union naval power had made the river impassable to their forces. This understanding began to undermine Confederate morale and contributed to increasing desertion rates among units that depended on river transportation for supplies and communication. Porter's fleet maintained the blockade with relentless efficiency. Coal and supplies flowed to his vessels from Union-controlled bases downstream. While Confederate forces found themselves increasingly isolated, the ironclads rotated their patrol duties, ensuring that fresh crews were always available to maintain the pressure on the besieged city. As the siege entered its second month, the effectiveness of naval power in modern warfare had been conclusively demonstrated. The Mississippi River, once the Confederacy's greatest highway, had become the instrument of Vicksburg's destruction. The first day of July, 1863, marked the beginning of the most intensive naval bombardment in American military history, as Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter ordered his entire fleet to concentrate their fire on Vicksburg's crumbling defenses. After 45 days of siege, the Confederate stronghold was weakening, and Porter was determined to deliver the coup de grace that would force the city's surrender. 13 ironclad gunboats took their positions in a carefully orchestrated line of battle, their heavy guns trained on specific targets within the Confederate fortifications. The flagship Benton, mounting 16 guns of various calibers, anchored in the main channel where her 11-inch Dahlgrens could reach every corner of the city. Porter himself directed the bombardment from her hurricane deck, his experienced eye identifying the most vulnerable points in the enemy's defenses. Commenced firing. Porter's command echoed across the water at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning. The thunderous roar that followed shook windows in houses 50 miles away, as over 200 naval guns opened fire simultaneously. The Mississippi River disappeared behind a wall of white smoke, as shell after shell arced toward the Confederate positions with devastating accuracy. Commander Henry Walk, aboard the battle-tested Carondelet, directed his gunners with the precision of a surgeon. His vessel's 9-inch guns had been firing on Vicksburg for months, and his crews knew exactly where to place their shots for maximum effect. The Confederate water battery, which had once posed such a threat to Union vessels, now lay in ruins under the concentrated fire of Walk's guns. The ironclad Louisville, positioned close to the eastern shore, delivered enfilade fire that swept the Confederate trenches with horrific effect. Commander Elias Kane Owen had maneuvered his vessel to a position where her 8-inch rifles could fire directly down the length of the enemy earthworks, making it impossible for Confederate soldiers to man their positions during daylight hours. According to Shelby Foote's comprehensive account in the Civil War, a narrative, this final bombardment represented the culmination of naval gunnery technique developed during 3 years of river warfare, with Union gunners achieving accuracy rates that would not be matched until the advent of modern fire control systems. The Confederate response was pitifully weak. Compared to the early days of the siege, Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton's artillery had been systematically destroyed by weeks of counter-battery fire, and ammunition shortages prevented sustained return fire. The few Confederate guns still in action fired sporadically, their shots falling harmlessly into the river or striking the thick armor of the Union ironclads without effect. Captain Isaac Newton Brown, commanding the last operational Confederate naval vessel in the Vicksburg area, watched helplessly as Porter's fleet pounded the city into submission. His ironclad Arkansas had been badly damaged in previous actions and lacked the ammunition necessary for effective combat. The Confederate River Navy, once a source of pride and hope, had been reduced to a handful of damaged vessels hiding behind the protection of shore batteries. The civilian population of Vicksburg endured unimaginable suffering during the final bombardment. Families huddled in caves dug into the hillsides, emerging only when the firing stopped to search for food and water. Emma Balfour, a resident of the city, wrote in her diary, "The bombardment is continuous now, day and night. The very earth shakes with each explosion, and we live like animals in burrows. How much longer can human beings endure such torment?" The accuracy of Union naval gunfire had improved dramatically since the beginning of the siege. Spotters positioned in tall trees and on elevated positions provided detailed reports on the fall of shot, allowing gunners to adjust their aim with scientific precision. Individual buildings within Vicksburg could be targeted and destroyed, demonstrating a level of accuracy that had been impossible at the start of the war. The psychological effect of the bombardment on Confederate defenders was as devastating as the physical damage. Soldiers who had endured months of siege warfare found their morale shattered by the constant pounding of naval artillery. Desertion rates soared as men slipped away from their positions under cover of darkness, choosing survival over duty. As night fell on July 1st, Porter's gunboats continued their relentless fire. The admiral knew that the end was near. Vicksburg could not withstand much more punishment, and Confederate resistance was crumbling under the weight of superior naval firepower. The morning of July 4th, 1863, dawned with an eerie silence over the Mississippi River, as the guns of Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter's fleet fell quiet for the first time in 47 days. A white flag fluttered from the Confederate earthworks overlooking the water, and Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton was ready to discuss surrender terms with Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant. The role of naval power in achieving this victory was unmistakable. Porter's ironclads had not merely supported the siege, they had made it possible. Standing on the hurricane deck of his flagship Benton, Porter surveyed the scene of his triumph with quiet satisfaction. The Confederate fortress that had once been called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy lay in ruins, its gun positions silenced, its defenders beaten into submission by the relentless application of naval firepower. The Mississippi River, America's greatest highway, was now entirely under Union control from its source to the Gulf of Mexico. The formal surrender ceremony took place at noon, with representatives from both the Army and Navy present to witness the historic moment. Porter himself came ashore to stand beside Grant. As Confederate forces marched out of their fortifications, their battle flags furled forever. The contrast between the two Union commanders was striking. Grant, compact and rumpled in his field uniform, at Porter, tall and distinguished in his naval dress blues. "Admiral," Grant said quietly as they watched the Confederate column pass, This victory belongs as much to your fleet as to my army. Without your guns, we could never have taken this place." Porter nodded, understanding the truth of Grant's words. The siege of Vicksburg had demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare required the closest cooperation between land and naval forces. His ironclads had provided the mobility necessary for Grant's daring campaign, the firepower to suppress Confederate defenses, and the strangling blockade that had starved the city into submission. The statistical evidence of naval effectiveness was overwhelming. During the 47-day siege, Porter's fleet had fired over 22,000 shells into the Confederate positions, systematically destroying artillery emplacements, supply depots, and communication lines. The accuracy of Union naval gunfire had improved to the point where individual buildings could be targeted and destroyed, a level of precision that would have been unimaginable at the war's beginning. Military historian James McPherson noted in Battle Cry of Freedom that the Vicksburg campaign marked the coming of age of American naval power, demonstrating that properly employed river navies could be as decisive as any fleet on the high seas. The capture of Vicksburg had immediate strategic consequences that extended far beyond the Mississippi Valley. President Abraham Lincoln, upon receiving news of the victory, reportedly said, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." The Confederacy was now split in two, with Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana effectively cut off from the rest of the South. Confederate forces west of the river would receive no more reinforcements or supplies from the eastern states. Captain Isaac Newton Brown, the last Confederate naval commander on the Mississippi, formally surrendered his remaining vessels to Porter's fleet. The once proud Confederate river navy had been reduced to a handful of damaged gunboats and converted steamboats, no match for the Union's overwhelming superiority in numbers, armor, and firepower. The dream of Confederate control over America's inland waters had died in the ruins of Vicksburg. The human cost of the naval campaign had been relatively light compared to the land battles. Porter's fleet had lost only one vessel to transport, Henry Clay, burned during the April night run past the Vicksburg batteries. Casualties among naval personnel totaled fewer than 200 men, a remarkably low figure considering the intensity and duration of the fighting. As the Stars and Stripes was raised over Vicksburg's courthouse, Porter reflected on the lessons learned during the long campaign. Naval power, properly applied, could dominate inland waterways just as effectively as ocean commerce routes. The combination of armored vessels, heavy artillery, and coordinated tactics had proven capable of reducing the strongest fortifications and supporting complex amphibious operations. The victory at Vicksburg established the United States Navy as a modern fighting force, capable of projecting power wherever American rivers flowed. The Mississippi River, once contested by two armies, now served as a Union highway stretching from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. The age of American naval supremacy on inland waters had begun, and it would never end.